back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz Podcast. Thanks for joining us today as we continue to talk about all sorts of things that pertain to our Catholic life. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined, as always, by Josh Sullivan.
Hello.
Welcome to you, Josh.
Thank you.
And Matt Van Milligan.
Hello.
Matthew, welcome.
Hi.
So, not the best of topics that I want to bring up to you, but I'm wondering if you heard about this priest that actually there's been a number of priests, but I think this one made headlines in the year 2024. And that was that this priest took, it was Pennsylvania, took parish funds, okay, money from the parish, and used them on games like Pokemon Go.
Mobile games.
Mobile games. And the amount, I think, Matt, because you know more about this than maybe most listening at home, what was the scandal that was involved here?
So he was charged criminally for embezzlement, and he used just over $40,000 of parish funds spent through an Apple ID account on mobile gaming. So things like Pokemon Go and Candy Crush Yeah, so like these games that have microtransactions for you can spend absurd amounts of money. And initially, when the report came out, he said it was a mistake, that he accidentally linked his Apple ID to the parish credit card, and his credit card was on there as well. And that, he just, I think the quote was, "I'm not a details guy," which maybe passes for like $50
More of a game.
or something like that.
$50.
But like at that quantity, but then, as it came out, he's like, "No, I have a problem." And it turns out that he had racked up a much more substantial debt.
So to be clear, for those of you who never heard the story, this was Father Lawrence Kozak from Pottstown, Pennsylvania. He's a Catholic priest, and he was caught using, over $214,000 that he used to play Candy Crush and Pokemon Go. Of that $200,000, $44,000 was from parish money. Terrible parish money. So why are we bringing up Father Kozak today? Because this sort of prompted us to look at the world of addictions, right? Obviously, when this, I don't think I've ever played Candy Crush or Pokemon Go in my life, right? So I don't know the ins and outs of it, but I'm just assuming maybe those listening at home today who do play Candy Crush, that to rack up a $200,000 bill on Candy Crush and Pokemon Go, there is a serious issue. There's an addiction there. And so today we're going to explore the world of addictions and see, what are the ramifications for our faith? What does our faith teach about addictions? And what are some of the signs and preventative measures?
And how to get over it? I'm going to even say, and what causes, not what causes, but what leads into, and are you at mortal sin if you have an addiction?
That's right.
And you sin?
And why we brought up the story about Father Kozak was not only because it prompted in the news, but also to illustrate that addiction can hit anyone.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, I think today we look at people with addiction like, they're living on the street and they're addicted to drugs.
Yeah.
Right? Or commonplace is addicted to alcohol or drugs. But in this case, it was obviously a video game addiction. Yeah. Right? There was use of funds. Also, that was just this year in 2024. But as a couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, I'm dating myself, the famous story in Ottawa, the nation's capital, Blessed Sacrament Church, Father Joe Leclerc, he admitted that he defrauded the church $130,000 for a gambling addiction. And then one of the most famous cases in Canada was Father Amar Saka. He was a Chaldean priest in the Diocese of London, Ontario. And get this, he gambled away $1 million of church money, which was actually a very sad story. I actually attended Mass with Father Amar Saka in the Chaldean Church in London when I was studying in the seminary. But Father Saka was a good guy, and he was raising money for refugees in the Chaldean community to come on over. And that was the money that he used, that he gambled away. He gambled $936,000. So there's an illness here.
And I think that's one of those things. A lot of times, and you kind of suggested it. A lot of times, people are like, "Wow, they just need to stop. They just need to kind of stop." But it actually goes a little bit deeper than that. Now we're talking about all sorts of addictions, and there's all different sorts. So an addiction is a compulsion. It's a having to do something, and sometimes it's not necessarily outside of your control, but it does become to the point where you actually don't really, your brain can get foggy. You can actually, your decision making and all that stuff can go down if you are not getting certain responses. So when you first get into it, we're going to talk about some of the addictions that just kind of come up. So we already talked drugs, alcohol, gambling. Screen time is becoming one of those ones that the mental health professionals are actually starting to, and I'm just going to say on my own, I left my phone at work and I went and coached some football. And for the 2 hours that I didn't have my phone next to me, I started getting panicky and I started feeling a little bit of anxiety. I thought, oh my goodness, I might have to look at this screen time addiction that I have. And not that I'm coaching football, I'm outside, I don't look at my phone at all, really. But it was just not having my phone near me.
Like in the back of your head.
Yeah, I started feeling anxious. And I was like, what is going on here? And I realized it's because I realized partway through that also my radio didn't work, because normally I listen to a podcast or something in the car. And so like 10 minutes into my drive, I'm like, oh, the music's not on. I don't have my phone. Oh, my phone's left back in my office. And then for about an hour and a half, 2 hours during practice, 2 or 3 things came up, and I thought, I'll check my phone. Oh, I don't have my phone. Oh my goodness, So that screen time addiction can really become a thing nowadays.
Big one today, pornography.
Masturbation, pornography,
Yeah.
kind of. They're called the lust addictions, but they kind of fall hand in hand to each other. Eating disorders, hoarding. Those are all, and the screen time, like I said.
Hoarding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an addiction, right? It's
Yeah.
a compulsion. It's trying to accompany. And again, most of these things, there is a natural response to a good response. I'm even going to say a lot of times to some of those things. Like for instance, eating. When you eat, your body has a natural reward system so that you do these things because they're good for you. So when you eat and you feel full a lot of times, or if you just eat, let's say, then you naturally feel good, and your body gives this dopamine rush to your brain specifically so you feel good about yourself. And so it's encouraging us in our most basic animal instincts to eat again because it's healthy for us and it's good. And for the same reason, sex. So the pleasures of sex can also have that same effect.
Sex addiction is a real thing.
It really is, but it has that same, because then we can procreate. And so evolution has caused us to. These are good things, and sometimes I'm going to even use like alcohol, for instance, allows us to dumb down our senses. So it allows us to stop feeling stress, stop feeling that, and also that influx of alcohol then sometimes can release that dopamine effect. Gambling, you're getting money, you're getting wealthier, whatever. When you do get a high, when you do get a rush from that, or obtaining a material wealth through hoarding or whatever. And so you feel like so all these things come from a natural basic instinct. The only one that isn't is drugs, but we'll talk about that in just a second, because what's happening with drugs is you are flooding yourself. You're actually pumping in the dopamine, or you're pumping in other drugs that will allow the dopamine release to happen. But all those things flood your brain with this extra sensation of something good, a natural high, if you will. So a lot of these addictions don't necessarily happen overnight. It's not like all of a sudden you are addicted, other than some of the drug ones. And so that's why it's a little bit different. And they're harder to crack sometimes, the drug ones, than some of the other ones, because if you flood your brain so much with these extra drugs, they stop producing, and there's a whole other science to it. For us, though, the natural high of eating, of gambling, of all those things, the church suggests, like drinking, within moderation, before you lose, your senses and stuff. Not a bad thing. You can have a drink as long as it doesn't, gambling. I mean, how many bingo halls supported Catholic churches throughout the years, right? And so putting $5 down on something is not a big deal as long as you're not going, again, past a certain point. Eating healthy. Eating's a healthy thing. Eating disorders, not so much, right? And so eating compulsions, and again, hoarding, collecting stuff. The church has no problem with you collecting stuff, but then if it's a certain point where it puts your life at risk. So what ends up happening is you get these. The brain remembers. Here, I got it written down here from the mental health Yale mental health. Brain remembers the surge of the dopamine and then starts to associate it with the addictive source, whatever that might be, whether it be, let's say, pornography, masturbation, or an eating disorder where you're eating carbs or you're eating whatever, gambling. Achieving this sensation becomes increasingly important to your brain. So you kind of are training. It's like Pavlov's dog, where you start salivating. So you start looking for this dopamine high, and to the point where the problem becomes twofold. You start searching for this high, and you start being able not to function without this high, and then your body also though becomes more becomes more tolerant to the dopamine. So you need a bigger high to get the dopamine hit. Does that make sense? So what ends up happening is you're gambling $5. I might win the $1 million lottery, even though you can walk outside and get hit by lightning faster. But you might win, and then that gambling becomes a little bit faster, a little bit hard. Or eating, you're slowly eating, and I feel good. Okay, now I have to have, instead of a hot dog, I gotta have 2 hot dogs, and then I gotta have 3 hot dogs, and I gotta have hot dogs and fries, and
someone pull out the dessert,
and then pull out the dessert, and then your eating disorder becomes more and more, and same with gambling, same with screen time, same with pornography, masturbation. We've talked about this on the show before, but a lot of times it starts off with just some basic nudity, then gets into harder pornography, and then can get into some weird, disgusting stuff. And the idea again is that the dopamine hit you're becoming dopamine tolerant, and so it has to get stronger, weirder, that kind of stuff as we go. Addiction, and then alcohol and
you
drug
have to
addiction,
do more to achieve the same chemical result.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's so. If we can continue on the kind of brain chemistry thing, because it is interesting, because it's ironic that this is your brain's natural reward system. This is like behavior modification to reinforce good behaviors.
Yeah.
But another aspect of this is, dopamine is the reward hormone or chemical. Cortisol is what your body produces when it's stressed, or it's the stress hormone, or it's the kind of opposite. But there's also a chemical response when you don't have these things. If you're overtired, if you're hungry, if you haven't eaten in a while, if your brain is associating these behaviors with positive outcomes, I'm hungry, I eat. Good. I'm not hungry, I'm stressed. It's supposed to inform good decision making. Like, okay, I need to go have food. I need to go do the thing that's good for me, so I can kind of get my chemicals back in balance. What your brain does is it starts associating this with these activities.
Yes.
So just like, I haven't gambled in a while. I don't know where my phone is. Mm-hmm. It's anxiety. It's negative hormone. It's negative. So again, what we do is, we soothe ourselves. We get back into that, dopamine state. So, and again, it doesn't have to be the thing. If you're hungry and you're released and it makes you anxious, you can seek that dopamine hit from any of those other areas that you talked about. I think hoarding was a really an example that surprised me, because it's like the need for material security is a good thing, and your mind reinforces that. But then again, it has the potential with all these other addictive behaviors to form this kind of chemical yo-yo effect in your mind that is, to a point where you're not making a conscious decision about an activity that's good for my development. I'm just doing this as a reaction because I need that chemical response.
Let me ask you a question. Let's say someone's listening today and they're just thinking about a behavior that they have in their life. How would they recognize in themselves that it has reached the point of an addiction? Like, what are the signs that we should look at in ourselves that have reached an addiction?
And this may come into our discussion about culpability and those types of things, but the main indicator clinically is impulse control. That it's like, I'm not actively choosing this. If you find yourself eating and you don't remember making the choice, that I did. I'm in this situation where I'm pressing buy on this mobile game or whatever, and it's impulsive. It's not something that you've done the math and you're like, oh, I can afford this. This is recreational. I planned for this ahead of time. If it's just reactive and loss of control, that's a pretty strong sign of addiction.
And it's really hard, I think, a lot of times because addiction is met a lot of times in our own selves with shame. We feel shameful, we feel guilty, we feel those types of things because naturally we know, if we're using gambling addiction as the thing, we know that, okay, I just lost the church so much money. Like, you feel guilty, you feel shameful. And so a lot of times I'm going to beat this on my own. And what happens is that your brain starts going to the point of getting these dopamine hits and getting these rewards. So you can be so far into an addiction past the point of just being able to help yourself. Meaning you can't just be like, okay, I'm going to stop now. I can stop cold turkey. And I think that's actually one of those things to kind of prove if you have an addiction or not, just stop. Give yourself, say, I'm not doing this for a month. See if you can stop for a month without any, and don't give yourself excuses. Don't give you like, I'm not going to eat at night for a month. I am not going to gamble for a month. I'm not going to have a drink. I'm not going to do use porn or masturbation for a month. Because I think what happens a lot of times is we justify the actions to ourselves. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is that a lot of times these things don't start off as an addiction. They slowly get it, as we talked about it, but also comes a lot of times addiction are formed out of trauma or stress. And so and you mentioned the stress hormone. So a lot of times it's a self-coping mechanism, and it's a way that we deal with things that have happened in our life. And it could be from our childhood, it could be from stress from a job or work, or from loss of a loved one, or whatever the case may be. And so a lot of times these types of, we're self-coping and trying to heal ourselves emotionally through this response. So it's really important to kind of know that, because even if you do slowly, one of the ways that you can, let's say pornography, masturbation and stuff, and there's a lot of different sites for addiction to help you wean yourself off of those dopamine hits. And a lot of times cutting cold turkey isn't possible. And so weaning yourself off, and you can kind of get into a normal dopamine cycle again. But if you haven't dealt with the emotional trauma or the emotion, like whatever the reason why you were self-medicating with the addiction or the dopamine hits, so that's why it really takes. Then it's not going to necessarily help. So you're going to turn to something different. And so a lot of times, and I'll use my own example. I was trying to get over eating at night for myself, and with eating disorder. And what I was watching TV, and when I was watching TV, I realized I was watching a very specific show, and I was eating at night. And so it got to the point, which was really interesting to me, that I stopped myself from eating at night. I was having a really hard time not eating at night, but I won that battle, But then I started watching the show in a doctor's office. The same show came up on the TV or whatever. I started watching it, and I started feeling really hungry, like so hungry
Like
to
a
the point that
Pavlovian
it
response.
really was,
Yeah.
right? And so, but what was interesting to me was I didn't realize that I was trying really hard not to eat at night. And one of the things I found was a really good thing for me was to get into video games. And so what stopped me from eating at night was to do video games at night. And what I realized was, and we didn't even talk about that, but there's a video game addiction.
Yeah, sure.
And so what I was doing was I was hitting one dopamine hit,
Yeah.
and I was coming off that dopamine hit and automatically replacing it with a different
something else.
right? And so, but I wasn't dealing then with maybe the emotional response that I needed to deal with to get off of those, to kind of slowly come in. So it's really important that when you're looking at this and you're trying to come off of it, you need to sometimes get physical, like you might have physical demand now for the dopamine that is really hard to break yourself off of. So you have to kind of wean yourself off, but you need to do that with help. But then you also probably need to go get spiritual and emotional help. And that could be through a spiritual direction, through a priest, a counselor, but very specifically, depending on if it's a drug addiction or any other addiction really, is to getting a sponsor that will help you, that have been through the process before and is willing to drop things. When we're talking about sponsors, it's really important to realize too, sponsors are really good things to have when it comes to addictions. But if you don't have someone that understands who you are, you have to have the right sponsor. And so if you've tried sponsorship and that and it doesn't quite work, sometimes you need to go in and find a Catholic sponsor. Like find someone who actually understands, like specifically if you're talking about like addiction to drugs and those types of things, but having a Catholic sponsor helps you understand, put things in perspective. But porn and masturbation or a sex addict, as you said, like having someone that has a Catholic perspective to that would be really helpful. So going to a priest and going talking, and then maybe they can help introduce you to groups that are around. there is a Catholics in Recovery group, catholicsinrecovery.com, I think it is. And I was looking it up just for this podcast, actually. And they have online virtual meetings specifically for all different sorts of addictions, but it's specifically to give a Catholic spin. So it's an online virtual meeting. You get on, it's a Zoom call, and they have certain times and certain dates and a lot of stuff. But yeah, there's lots of different programs out there, and that's also another place if you're heavy into an addicted substance, a drug or alcohol, or anything. Gives you a good resource of ways to look for sponsors, way to look for how to deal with an addiction, not on your own per se, but how to get the help you need properly.
I like you bring that up because I truly believe at the root of every problem, there's a spiritual issue.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
I truly believe that. And so I think with any addiction or any problem, there are spiritual and practical solutions, right? So someone could guide you to make practical choices, but there's a spiritual element to our addiction, right? When you were talking about moving to a video game, sort of replacing, I thought of the scripture from Luke chapter 11, verse 24, and it's talking about when you get rid of the evil spirit.
Another one.
It says this: when the unclean spirit, this is Luke 11, 24. When the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it wanders through waterless regions looking for a resting place, but not finding any. It says, I will return to my house from which I came. When it returns, it finds it swept and put in order. Then it goes and brings 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they enter and live there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. Okay?
Yeah.
When we remove something from our life, we have to replace it with something good, or else we just have this empty void in our life that is just leaves us sort of susceptible to another addiction.
And sometimes when we're dealing with things like loss and we're dealing with trauma in our lives, part of the reason I think that God allows trauma in our lives is to allow us to turn and just surrender to him. And so, because we have these God-shaped holes in our heart. And so being able to just turn to him and say, and a lot of us, it means hitting rock bottom before we can actually get there. Like you have to almost go through the addiction, you have to go through the trauma, and then be like, okay, I can't do this anymore. And then at your wit's end, turn to God and be like, okay, take this from me. I can't handle this. And in that surrender, in that actual surrender, not a fake surrender, but like a full surrender to God and saying, okay, take this from me. God can fill that hole in your life and then start to, from the loss or from trauma or from whatever might have happened. God allows that because he wants us to depend on him. He wants us to surrender. He wants us to lean on him. He wants to love us and show us that we don't need to worry about or anything. He'll take care of us he'll take care of our every need. And so he allows those things to happen. We sometimes try to fill it with other things first until we finally realize that. And so turning it in, and we have to, like you said, fill it with the good stuff, fill it with the good. And realizing too, when we talk about addiction, the other thing that we talk about is you have to understand when you're going into an addictive behavior, you're looking for a dopamine hit, and why. And so sometimes, and I'm sure people have heard this before from different addiction, but we use the HALT method. And so a lot of times, why are you looking for a dopamine hit? And so you got to hit the things that are just basic needs, which is HALT, HALT. Are you hungry? Hungry. I was going to say hangry, but hungry. Are you hungry? Like, are you actually hungry? Have you eaten today? And because sometimes you're looking for a dopamine hit, which is actually you need to feed yourself because you haven't eaten. That's never been one of my problems. I'm always on the opposite end of that. But are you hungry? Are you angry? Are you feeling stressed out, angry, emotional of some sorts? Then you need to put the proper, maybe going and masturbating is not the proper release there. Maybe what you need to do is go and look at a proper way. Why are you angry? Deal with the issues that are there. Are you lonely? So the L is HAL. L is lonely. Are you lonely? Are you maybe a lonely person? And that's why you're giving into alcoholism or you're taking drugs, is because you've got time on your hands, you have nothing else to do, and you're just alone and you feel crappy about yourself and your life. So you're going to take the drugs, you're going to drink the alcohol, or you're going to gamble just to kind of fill that time and give you the high. And then the last one is tired. And so those 4 things can really help curb the addiction if you're looking at...
To recognize the signs.
To recognize the signs. Yeah. Okay, I'm looking for a dopamine hit. I'm looking for something, and to feed it properly and in the proper response. Again, if you're hungry and you have a eating disorder, then you have to properly discern what that is. But
and if someone's listening today, maybe they're realizing maybe something going on in my life is more of an addiction than I thought. You know, the proper course of action here is to seek help.
Yeah.
You know, the Lord tells us to bring things to the light. We can't deal with things until they're brought to the light. If they're kept in the darkness, then we can't really deal with them effectively, right? And I think that's really important for people to encourage people to speak to someone close to you. I don't like the website that you mentioned. There's a good idea because it's somewhere. I'm guessing it's somewhere in the States.
It is,
you
yeah,
know. So
yeah.
someone
They have some
listening here,
meetings. I looked at them. They have some in Toronto, but
and if people are afraid to talk to someone close to them, you can talk to someone online, virtually, and maybe not have that embarrassment of talking to someone that you know. But now the Lord is calling us now to end these things because they're preventing us from flourishing in life, and they're preventing us from our path to salvation. I want to ask the question here. Let's say someone who is addicted to something, right, that would be considered a mortal sin. Gambling in excess is a mortal sin. The use of
Drugs.
Pornography, masturbation is mortal sin. The use of drugs, excessive alcohol use, all these things are mortal sins. The Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us that the virtue of temperance disposes us to avoid any excess.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a virtue that we have to grow in, obviously. But my question here is about someone's culpability. Yeah. Now, if someone, to commit a mortal sin, there has to be freedom involved in making the choice freely to commit the sin. Someone who's addicted, that freedom is jeopardized, right?
And this is really tricky ground, and so we got to understand it very specifically. But I agree with you.
I think that's the right way of putting it. That your freedom is jeopardized or compromised. It isn't removed, and there are kind of pop culture approaches to addiction that, like, okay, this is purely chemical. They don't necessarily look at the spiritual or the moral component. That is just like, okay, this is how you've kind of rewired your brain to work, and this is in this kind of materialist determinist space that it's like, okay, you're just a combination of chemical processes, and it's of course you did that because that's what you're chemically determined to do, and there's no moral aspect. There's no culpability because your will isn't engaged. But I think that again, a proper view is that yes, your judgment is impaired by the addiction. Your will is not as free as it would be otherwise. But again, to kind of ask the question or to take the question, that you are culpable to the degree in which your will is engaged and choosing. So you may be less culpable, but there still is an element of culpability in the act itself if it is something you're choosing, or passively choosing to not do. Which is not a good way of putting that. But also, in Catholic moral teaching, there's you talk about the near occasion of sin. Yeah. You put yourself in a situation where that you're going to participate in this addictive behavior, and again, just kind of practically speaking, you can implement safeguards to keep yourself from that situation. A few weeks ago, our gospel was, if your left arm causes you to sin, cut it off, because it's better to enter heaven maimed than it is to enter hell, fully intact. Like if your phone is the cause of your
gambling addiction.
If it, maybe a smartphone isn't the best for you. Get a flip phone. Get it put passwords on things that you don't have. Do what you can do to make sure that you're not in a situation where your will is compromised.
Yeah, there's a really good app actually for when you're talking about phones, because gambling, pornography, masturbation, and a lot of addictions can happen on a smartphone. And so one of the things is Covenant Eyes. There's Covenant Eyes. There's Custodio. I use Custodio. Spelled with a Q, Q-U. And it allows me to have full reign. It allows a culpable partner, I'm going to say, to have full reign over someone else's device. So I have it for my kids, to be honest with you, and my wife and I. So whenever my kids look up something, they gives me a warning. And so you have two options. One is to turn it off completely, and the other is to give a warning. And so my sons, it's really funny because my sons look up stuff online and it will come across to my phone giving me a warning that, hey, they're looking up. So one was how to make a hobbit pipe. right? And so like they wanted to carve out, Lord of the Rings. We're watching Lord of the Rings together as a family, and they wanted to carve out a Hobbit pipe, and I got a warning. Drug use because it has the word pipe in it, and or there's a lot of them have come across and it's interesting to watch, but it's there's no way of beating some of these systems, meaning that you're culpable. I really enjoy for my kids growing with my kids to being on top of it is mostly specifically that it's only warnings. So they give me the warning, and then if I get a warning, I can go talk to my kids about it if it's necessary or not. I haven't had a situation yet, which I've been really thankful for, but it is a way of keeping culpable. So have one of your good friends that's going to be in it with you, or your husband or your wife. If you have a gambling addiction or a pornography addiction, like your spouse is in it with you whether they like it or not, and so being culpable to them and putting this kind of stuff on their phone and your phone, so that when you look up something, when you look up a game, or if you look up pornography wording or whatever the case may be, it automatically flags it for them. Hey, there's a warning. They can then call you and say, hey, what's up? Having a good friend be that culpable person, and they get the flag and then they can call you. So again, not doing it on your own, I think, is a really big thing, because you know what? You might be at the point where you can't do it on your own. You need to have another person step in and help.
On the note about culpability, I think I think it would be wrong to say that in general, that if you feel like you might be addicted to something, that that you have no control over it, and therefore you're not as culpable for that.
Yeah.
I think there's a good opportunity to speak to a priest or a confessor or a spiritual director about those situations, because I think honestly that sometimes we just say, well, I'm addicted, and so
Give up. Yeah.
I can still receive the Eucharist because my freedom has been impeded. But I think we're a little more free than we think.
Yeah.
Like you said, we can do things, and Matt, you said the same thing too. Like we can have accountability partners. We can do things to say, get away from our smartphone. I know the Franciscan University of Steubenville, Ohio, had this pilot project where they offered students, if they traded in their smartphone, they would get a dumb phone, like that would just text and email or whatever, and $5,000. But the catch was, for the entire year, you had to
use the dumb phone. Yeah.
And scores of students lined up for it. They saw it as an opportunity. Let's to get rid of many of the things that are troubling them in their life. So there are things that we can do. So having an addiction per se, it does not give you the freedom to receive the Eucharist, but there are things that you can try. I would say if you're in that situation, to talk to a spiritual director, to talk to a priest.
Yeah, and you kind of hit the nail too. You're culpable. Like if you fall into an addictive action of whatever it might be, there's a reason why most churches offer confession on Saturday evening before Mass, and or before other masses as well, right? But like a lot of times it's a Saturday afternoon, so that if you have fallen into a state of sin, that you can go and confess. And you sometimes need that spiritual grace and the blessings that God that gives you through confession, the strength that it goes through confession to get over some of that addiction. And then you can receive the Eucharist, and you can do all that with a good, clear conscience. And so now there's a whole other debate to be had, or maybe not even debate, but if you have done everything possible, you've fallen into a state of sin because of whatever the case may be, and you've tried to get to confession, all that stuff, but it is because of addiction, then that's a serious discussion to have with a spiritual advisor about whether you can receive communion or not. And I'm only going to say that it's an individualized basis that you can say that. You can't say, I have an addiction, I can receive communion. You can't use that as the excuse. But I find a lot of times we do fall into that. Well, I got an addiction, and this is just the way it is. So I'm going to keep it at bay, and then I won't let it get worse. No.
And sorry, just with what you were saying about like the path forward, is it like finding someone who you're accountable to? One of the tragic, or probably the most tragic part about the situation with these priests developing an addiction to the point where it has huge consequences. First of all, they are in a position of moral authority over their and that itself is problematic. But in all of our kind of this is what you don't go it alone. Get someone like I imagine the conditions that enabled this addictive behavior to flourish was isolation. Was that I need to go to another priest. I need to be in a community of people that I can be vulnerable with, that I can talk to, that I can have some visibility on my activity, that I can have some accountability for what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I think that as much as addictions are terrible, they not only affect a person, they also affect a family.
Yeah.
They also affect friends, especially when it's gotten to a point where it's really bad.
Yeah.
We're praying for people who are in situations like that, whether you are suffering with an addiction right now or you have a family member or a friend. And I think let's not forget the importance of praying for that person and praying that the Lord may insert, grace and a transformation, even an opportunity to move past that addiction. I think is really important that we pray for. But also churches and communities have lots of places like AA groups, Drugs Anonymous, Sex Anonymous, all these groups. There's lots of resources online. But now is the time. If you're listening today and you have something in your heart, something going on in your life, now's the time that the Lord is calling us to get rid of those things, because He wants us to live a life that's fulfilling, that's full of grace, and that leads us to salvation. That's all the time we have today. So if you have any comments to add to this conversation, maybe you have a story of how you overcame an addiction, maybe someone in your family, maybe God has helped in certain situations that you want to share that with us, you can send us a message at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com. You can also like this episode or share it with your friends and family members too. That's all the time we have today. So for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.